Hello team players! In my last video, I covered all the familiar abilities that affect the familiar itself. So now it's time for me to cover all the abilities that affect you as the master of the familiar. Let's dive in. First up, we have Absorb Familiar. This essentially allows your familiar to transform into some kind of birthmark or tattoo. While transformed in this way, it is unaffected by area effects and requires specific targeting, which requires the knowledge that it's a creature. What this essentially means is you and your allies can heal or assist the familiar, while most enemies are unaware of its true nature. It requires a DC 20 perception check to realize that it's a familiar. Your familiar can still communicate empathically, but otherwise cannot take actions except to turn back into a familiar. Transforming to either form requires 1 minute and has the concentrate trait. This one is really good for any spellcaster that wants to be in melee and has a familiar. It's a good way to protect the familiar, as most enemies aren't even going to know it's there. And it's also pretty good for just if you want to support the familiar and go full familiar. Your familiar does have to come out in order to even use its abilities. So keep that in mind. Cantrip connection is really amazing. You get an extra cantrip. Either you can prepare an extra cantrip, or you can add a cantrip to your spell repertoire, depending on what type of spellcaster you are. Not only do cantrips auto-heighten, but you can cast them as many times as you want, which means this is a very, very good ability, as an extra cantrip, pretty darn amazing. However, this cantrip will always be the same until you retrain it. You can't otherwise change it. So you do have to be careful about which cantrip you end up picking. Also, obviously, you need to be able to cast spells to use this. So, no alchemist, I'm afraid. Familiar Focus allows your familiar to spend 2 actions once per day for you to gain back one of your focus points, up to your usual maximum. Really good for anybody who has focus points in a focus pool, but especially good for witches. Witches have quite a few hexes that you would want to use more. I mean, granted, a lot of them are hex cantrips, but still, if you use focus points a lot, this could be incredibly useful. Next we have Innate Surge. Once per day, your familiar can grant you 1 more use of an innate spell you gained from an ancestry feat. You still have to cast the spell, and you still have to meet all the other requirements. So, if you're like silenced or something, you can't use this. But there are a lot of ancestries that give amazing innate spells. Gorons, Protector Tree, gnomes, invisibility. Elves can pick pretty much any spell they want. So this one is incredibly useful if you have the right ancestry. Unfortunately, I'm not a huge fan of lifelink. If your familiar would go down to 0 hit points, you can take that damage instead. But anything else like snake venom still applies to the familiar. The truth is, number 1, if you're a spellcaster, then you're not going to have many hit points. I mean, you're going to have more than your familiar, but still, this can be incredibly dangerous if you use it at the wrong time. Second, almost all monsters are going to target you, not their familiar. So, this becomes useless. I highly recommend you skip this one. Share Senses, on the other hand, is really good out of combat. Once per 10 minutes, you can use a single action to project your senses through your familiar. You lose all sensory information from your own body, but can sense through your familiar for 1 minute. You can dismiss this effect at any time. Really, really good if you want your familiar to scout ahead. So you can see in here what your familiar sees and hears. I highly recommend this familiar ability if you're a scouting character. But since familiars are usually only available to spellcasters, makes it kind of difficult. Of course, there are ways to get familiar with martials, such as rangers. This would be amazing on a ranger. But overall, kind of situational. but it's a good feat. Spell battery is also really good. It gives you an extra spell slot, at least 3 ranks lower than your highest ranked spell slot. Of course, this means you have to be able to cast 4th rank spells to take this. Of course, this means that alchemists can't take this familiar ability, and most spellcasters are going to have to be around level 7 to take this. But an extra 1st rank spell, up to a maximum of a 7th rank spell, pretty darn amazing. Especially considering that you can pick any spell for this. If you wanted to use touch spells as a spellcaster, I highly recommend Spell Delivery as a familiar ability. It essentially allowed the familiar to deliver the touch spell rather than you. In other words, you're safe, and the familiar uses 2 actions to move up and touch the target. Of course, this does put your familiar in danger, but I suppose it's better than you in danger. This is where the healing abilities of the familiar come in handy, but yeah, there are a lot of really good touch spells. If you don't want to take Reach Spell and spend an extra action, I mean, you're spending an extra action anyway, but if you want to use your familiar to do it, fine. If you want to take Reach Spell, go for it. Alright, with Recall Familiar, you can spend a 3-action activity to call your familiar to your side. The familiar must be within 1 mile or the attempt fails. This is considered a teleportation effect. Again, this is really good for scouting ahead with your familiar. It can scout ahead, you can use Share Senses, and as soon as it's done, you can use this, it's back at your side. Unfortunately, it is a once per day thing, but you're probably only going to need to scout ahead with your familiar once a day anyway. And Restorative Familiar allows your familiar to heal you. It can spend 2 actions to heal you for 1d8 times half your level. So if you're level 4, that's 2d8. If you're level 6, that's 3d8, so on and so forth. You get the idea. Very, very good for spellcasters that have low defenses, like sorcerers and witches. Especially sorcerers, since they have some of the lowest defenses in all of Pathfinder 2e. So those are all the master abilities from Player Core 1. But we still have more to talk about. Starting with Player Core 2. Starting with Extra Alchemy. This gives you 1 more alchemical item during your daily preparation. And of course, you gotta be an alchemist to take this, because you need advanced alchemy. But having an extra item per day is pretty good, as you can use it on anything. You just have to be an alchemist with the alchemical familiar feat. Next we have Extra Vial, which is similar but different. Basically, once per day, you can interact with your familiar if it's adjacent to you to gain another versatile vial. So, like for quick alchemy, say. This is amazing at early levels, as you're more likely going to run out of versatile vials at those levels. But as you level up, this gets less and less useful. So, keep that in mind. At high levels, you're almost never going to run out of versatile vials, so at high levels, don't take this. And lastly, we only got 1 master ability from the Tian character guide, and that is Kindling. Once per day, as a free action, when you cast a spell that has the fire trait, deals damage, and doesn't have a duration, you can sacrifice your familiar. If you do so, the spell in question deals additional damage equal to twice the spell's rank. This one is good for witches that can easily get their familiar back, but only at the end of the day to finish off an enemy, as you're sacrificing your familiar in order to do this. So if you're a witch that specializes in fire, this could be very useful for you. And that's going to do it for this video. Don't forget to check out the links in the description below for my Patreon, my Discord, and my other social media. If you're more interested in abilities for the familiar itself, you can check out this video here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and remember, teamwork is vital. It helps us solve problems.